This video has been sponsored by Squarespace. I told my roommate that this week's video was going to be on the newest Tolkien publication, and she replied by saying, "Wait, isn't he dead?" Which, I'll be honest, is a pretty fair question, because it's kind of amazing that in the 50 or so years since Tolkien's death, there have been around 50 books published in his name, and we are still finding new material to publish from him even in the year 2025. Just this fall, a new Tolkien book was put out, and I am very pleased to say that the Bovadium Fragments is entertaining, niche, and so incredibly Tolkien. While he may be best known for his sprawling fantasy epics, many of Tolkien's posthumously published works paint a very particular portrait of the man. He wasn't someone trying to escape the real world, or to ignore it by disassociation into fairy realms. Rather, he was someone remarkably skilled at using the tool of fiction to communicate his very non-fictional frustrations, fears, and profoundest hopes. An artful collision of scholarly in-jokes, linguistic somersaults, and genuine concern for the progress of society, the Bovadium Fragments is quintessential Tolkien. And today, I'm going to tell you all about it. Now, full disclosure, I will be spoiling the entirety of this story throughout the progress of this video, so if you do want to go into reading the Bovadium Fragments completely blind, I recommend that you save this video until afterwards. But like so many of Tolkien's works, I would say that this story really flourishes under deeper analysis and understanding beyond just knowing the events of the plot, so, you know, if you haven't read it, you should still be able to enjoy this video. But I know for sure that by the end of this video, you are going to want to be making yourself a website using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website building platform that's going to help you stand out and succeed online. You can get your website discovered fast with Squarespace's integrated SEO tools. Every one of their websites is optimized to be indexed with meta descriptions, an auto-generated sitemap, and more. All the things that you need to show up on search engines and bring in new customers. And with Squarespace's cutting-edge design tools, anyone can build themselves a perfectly customized website. Start with one of their professionally designed website templates or with their Blueprint AI website builder, and use their intuitive drag and drop technology to create a website that beautifully matches your brand and style. And you can keep track of how all of this is going with Squarespace's intuitive built-in analytics tools. You can review your website traffic, figure out where to focus your engagement, and track your revenue all in one place. If you're interested in revamping an existing brand or building a completely new one, Squarespace is the place to do it. You can head down to squarespace.com for a completely free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JessOfTheShire to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors. The Bovadium Fragments, or as Tolkien originally called it, the End of Bovadium, is essentially a meditation on the way that new technology, particularly cars, was taking over once rural England. But because it's Tolkien, it's never quite that simple. The story comes to us in the form of a scholarly dissertation, in which scholars in the distant future are looking back on documents that were writing about the time when cars took over and destroyed society. So the timeline goes kind of like this. In and around Tolkien's contemporary day, so the end of the 20th century, cars took over and destroyed society. And then, sometime after that, documents were written recounting the story of how cars destroyed society. And now, in the contemporary day of the story of the Bovadium Fragments, which is in our distant future, people are looking back on these documents about the fall of Bovadium, which had happened in the past for them. Okay, I think I made that actually way more confusing. So basically, it's like if someone in the really far future was looking back on our documents about the fall of Atlantis. Kind of. But the really neat thing about the story being as meta and convoluted as this is that it gave Tolkien the room to explore far more ideas than simply a vehicular apocalypse. Every story is shaped by its storyteller and the manner of its telling, And the tone of these fragmented tales, this elevated biblical voice, lends a kind of alien grandeur to things that are very real and very contemporary for us today. It helps us draw a connection to the stories of our own culture, to the history of our own world. It reminds us that the same world that wrote of disasters like the Great Flood or the fall of Atlantis is the same world that we live in today. And with this story, Tolkien's love of wordplay was really in full force, and you kind of have to look at every word a bit closer. Take, for example, Dr. Saravelk and Dr. Gums, who, if their names are reversed, you can begin to see how Tolkien felt about professors of their ilk. Dr. Saravelk introduces us to the prehistoric Vasti site, where archaeology shows a once great civilization thrived and then suffered a catastrophic downfall. Now, the term Vasti, it has been noted, is a derivation from the word varsity, which in itself originated as a shortening of the word university. So we know that this Vasti settlement was once a university. In particular, Tolkien's own beloved Oxford University. Dr. Saravelk describes the civilization of Vasti as being divided into two groups of people, People A and People B. People A were the original settlers of the land, who dwelled in large stone forts and spoke an archaic version of the language, and People B were a group of people that moved into Vasti later on, who brought their own more contemporary language that would soon overwhelm the culture of People A. People A eventually assimilated into the language and culture of People B, and Dr. Saravelk and Gum and the people of their era have only ever been able to interpret and translate the language of People B. The language of People A remains elusive to them. As Saravelk writes, the superior People B would take little interest in the writings of the A people, while the latter, as soon as they had begun to acquire the B language, would abandon the archaic productions of their own primitive culture to the care of antiquarian scholars. Now, to the best of my interpretation, and I am open to being corrected here, I think that People A represent the old guard. The scholars and academics living in the stone forts of Oxford University, hanging on to their archaic, perhaps even Latin language, whereas People B represent the influx of newcomers that arrived when Oxford began to industrialize. And you may be asking me, Jess, how do we know that this is specifically about Oxford University? Well, apparently, the people who lived in the Vasti civilization called the place Bovadium, which is derived from the term vadum bovinum. And that term is derived from the Latin word for shallow water and pertaining to oxen. You might say it is a ford pertaining to oxen. Oxford. This is really just Tolkien at his absolute nerdiest, and I do mean that as a compliment. The actual fragments of this story, the documents about Bovadium, are split into three parts. The first fragment is entirely in the untranslatable language of People A, which for our purposes is Latin. Fragment 2, they believe, is a translation of Fragment 1, but it is written in the language of People B, and it is continued. And as you'll remember, they were able to crack language B, and so the fragment is presented to us in modern English. Fragment 2 opens, there was an ancient city called Bovadium, where, in the time-honored halls of the Academy, many men, both learned and pupils, pursued the liberal arts. They speak of the wide and beautiful main street, the Via Maxima, that allowed people to pass from one side of the realm to the other. It was a sleepy and content town, Bovadium, one where scholars wanted little more than to be able to nap between stacks of books. But the peace of Bovadium was shattered by the schemings of a great demon, who devised in his terrible workshops machines called motores. The motores flooded the streets of Bovadium, pouring out smoke and putrid steam from their guts, hunting horses and innocent pedestrians alike. But the worst of all may be the motor bus, a huge, hulking evolution of the pedestrian vehicle. The fragment then recounts a poem by the ancient author Pius, which uses the languages of both people A and B to criticize these motor buses. This poem was a real-world poem that Tolkien loved, written by A.D. Godley in 1914. It opens with the line, "What is this that roareth thus? Can it be a motor bus? Yes, the smell and hideous hum indicat motorum bum." This poem is a push and pull of Latin and English grammar that plays on the idea that the word bus is derived from Latin origins, and I will be freely honest here in admitting that I don't know enough Latin for this poem to make sense to me, but I'm sure that there is someone watching this video who does understand why this poem is funny, and I would encourage you to leave a comment for the entire class so that we can all understand it better. But Tolkien loved this poem, and it was a major inspiration for the Bovadium Fragments, both in the way that it plays with language and criticizes how readily we accepted these machines into our lives. And so he put it in his story, attributing it to an author named Pius. The original author was named Godley, his author is named Pius. Pious and godly mean the same thing. I'm not gonna lie, this book made me laugh, like full-on, loud enough to wake up my rats laughter, far more times than I ever anticipated it would, and if that's not an endorsement, I don't know what is. Anyway, Pius's poem does nothing to stop the endless flow of progress into Bovadium. At the working of the demon, the motores continued to bring forth an ever larger progeny. For, shame to relate, many of the citizens harbored the monsters, feeding them with the costly oils and essences which they required, and building houses for them in their gardens. For the demon promised to each separately that any motor which he so tended would become his servant, and would bear him with great speed wherever he wished, and thus he would outstrip all other men, and he would, moreover, be rid forever of the labor of walking. As the fierce cacophony grew more and more deafening, people found themselves unable to sleep, unable to walk, unable even to breathe without the disturbance of the demon. They realized that these things were destroying their home, but every person who said that thought that their own motor wasn't the problem. Rather, it was all those people coming in from out of town that were ruining everything, causing the congestion, the traffic, the pollution, the vehicular accidents. Even the very most vocal critic of the motor also had one of them in their own homes. Anything to avoid falling behind. The demon had promised that the motores would grant people peace, but the machines themselves destroyed that peace. He had promised the people speed, but they ended up stuck in traffic jams all day, where it probably would have been faster just to walk. He had vowed that the motores would give people convenience, ease, and more time to live their lives, and yet those who owned them were constantly plagued by maintenance, payments, and trying to find places to store their precious machines. Rather than going to church and worshipping on Sundays, mankind now bowed to its new masters, pouring effort and money into these machines day and night. Planners came out of the woodworks with schemes to reroute traffic, to build newer, bigger, better roads, to do anything to help this problem except restrict the actual machines themselves. They decided that rather than change the motores or ignore them outright to fix this problem, it was the city of Bovadium itself that must change. They write, "At heart, men were enamored of the motores, and the secret wish of every man was that he alone should possess a motor and ride it at ease, but other men should go on foot and preserve the peace. Men were forever riding here and there looking for peace, which their motores destroyed as soon as they found it." Rather than limiting or changing the machines themselves, planners turned their gaze to nature. Easy, destructible, disposable nature. Ancient buildings, centuries-old trees, bucolic fields, all fell under the desire to build more roads, more infrastructure, more places for the motores to reign.
A fierce debate arose between the north and south of Bovadium, both of them arguing for their own good over the good of all, and all of the people with decision-making power would rather sit there, lazy and happy, allowing the arguments to volley back and forth over their heads, than try and make any sort of tangible change. All over the realm, the rot of Bovadium spread, the concentration of man and machine tipping in favor of the motores, until there were so many of them that they reached a standstill. Therefore, day by day, the uproar and stench went on increasing in Bovadium, until the voices of the debaters and the lamentation of the afflicted, and even the shouts of the planners, could be heard no more. And so the matter ended. There came at last a day when every street, every road, lane, alley, court, and byway was blocked. Nothing could move either forward or backward. All motores stopped dead. Silence fell, the silence of a tomb. For when men came to the city, walking over the tops of the inert motores, they found that all the inhabitants were dead. Slain by the poisonous fumes, their shades had fled to seek a cleaner air in hell. There now, it is said, they stood, deaf ghosts upon the shores of Styx. A spirit steps forward to announce that unfortunately the old ferryman has had to be fired for inefficiency, but worry not, because the demon has just invented a fleet of brand new shiny motorboats. And although the fee for these is a bit higher than the old rowboat had been, they should be able to get everyone across the river in no time. And so, Fragment 2 ends, the fall of Bovadium complete. Fragment 3 picks up with the survivors of the fall, and an old man standing over the ruins declaring a mighty speech in the old tongue. People gather to listen to him speak, and so he translates, "The Lord said unto the doctors and masters, Why are ye sad, and why do ye trouble my ear? Did you not speak in your folly, saying, We shall be swifter than the winds? Whatsoever we wish, we shall do straightway? Lo, ye have feet, and ye walk not. Ye totter upon your legs." Against this condemnation, the people cry out, saying, "Why aren't you blaming the demon? Is it not his fault that these awful machines came in and ruined our society?" But the old man is quick to correct them, saying that although the demon may have invented this monster, it was mankind that helped to build them. Men worked there to make the things that you clamored for. Now they are buried under piles of motores, made and half-made, which no man can move. There they will rot, for the demon is no longer interested in them. The demon had long since moved on, undoubtedly to get to work on the next atrocity, and mankind was left waiting in the rubble that they had helped to create. Mankind wandered off, trying to figure out a new way to survive, and in trying to resurrect one of the motores, a man lights one on fire, the fire spreads, and the entire city of Bovadium is left in flames. In reflection upon these fragments, our scholars, Drs. Saravelk and Gums, seem rather dismissive, or at the very least skeptical of how anyone could be so stupid as to allow something like this to happen to them. Much like modern scholars bemoaning the degeneracy of the Dark Ages, they say,
"It is hard to believe that there were ever in this country so many men or so rich. It is impossible to believe that, if so, they would squander all they had in such a lunatic fashion. We, at any rate, are not likely to fall into such folly. We do not believe in the demon, and if we did, we should give no ear to one that prompted us to the making of large machines." The scholars explain that actually their society is right on the verge of a huge scientific breakthrough that'll make their way of lives so much easier and so much more convenient. Surely that could never, and has never, gone wrong. The Bovadium Fragments is quirky and funny, and obviously a very entertaining satire, but they also stand as a very real, very scathing critique of the way that humans view progress. Because although in Tolkien's lifetime the fall of Bovadium did not catastrophically come about as it did in this story, throughout his life he did watch the Bovadium that he knew come to an end. Tolkien always held a lifelong yearning for the rustic, undisturbed peace that he remembered from his childhood. He recalled his youth as a place of sun-drenched forests, playing with friends and family in the fields, gazing out at the dappled shade of trees through his bedroom window. But following the death of his mother, young Tolkien had to move into a grungy, industrialized city, and this dramatic shift left an impact on him for the rest of his life. In Tolkien's biography, Humphrey Carpenter writes, Ronald, still numb from the shock of his mother's death, hated the view of almost unbroken rooftops with the factory chimneys beyond. The green countryside was just visible in the distance, but it now belonged to a remote past that could not be regained. He was trapped in the city. His mother's death had severed him from the open air. Tolkien found that there was a drastic difference between the countryside and the city, and one of the major differences was the presence of the car in the cities, something that would only worsen over time. When Tolkien first arrived in Oxford in 1911, it was still practically a small town, surrounded by an open rural community. Its primary industry was printing, and it was mostly just a market town until the intervention of one William R. Morris. Morris was an Oxford native who owned a bicycle repair shop in the city. But as personal vehicles became more widely available, he also started selling cars. And it wasn't long before he realized that if he made the cars himself, well, he could make a lot more money. He released his first car, the Morris Oxford, in 1913, and quickly found a hungry market among the students and civilians of Oxford. By 1914, Morris was making over 1,000 new cars every single year, and by the end of the decade, they were the largest car manufacturer in the UK. And as always, increased demand meant increased production, which meant increased workers. And before long, the chemistry of Oxford had completely changed. Their industry was different, their population was massive, and all of these people and things needed a way to get around. Reflecting back on this time decades later, Tolkien would recall, Oxford continues to suffer from the ravages of the machine worshippers. I remember it as a little old university town nestling in the country, and it had about 55,000 inhabitants. It now has nearly 100,000 more, sprawls in every direction, and is jammed with noise and smell. Throughout the interwar period, Oxford was one of the UK's fastest growing cities, and most of these people, because they were in the industry, had cars, and these cars needed somewhere to drive. Before, when Oxford was largely a university town, there wasn't a great need for efficiency in roads. Walking and bikes could get you by most of the time, and these things don't take up a lot of space. But with new industry, new workers, and new materials flooding in and out of Oxford constantly, the storied streets of the city were under more pressure than they had ever been before. And, as we saw in the Legend of Bovadium, congestion was the only natural result. As historian Lawrence Dale writes, it is beyond question that the complaint that Oxford suffers from is arteriosclerosis. The ancient arteries can no longer cope with the life that surges through them. One of the main problem areas for Oxford's traffic problem was the city's main street, which had once been well-traveled, but historical and beautiful, but it now more closely resembled a smoggy parking lot with the way that cars were so often brought to a standstill on the street. And one of the main suggested relief strategies for this was first brought up by Lawrence Dale, and that was to build a new road into the heart of the city that would cut directly through the Christ Church meadow. This would take some of the pressure off of Main Street and also help to unify the quickly dividing hemispheres of the city. But the problem was that Christchurch Meadow had been preserved as a very special place by the university and by the people that lived there before the university for literally hundreds of years. No matter the bustle of the city, this meadow had stood untouched, an isolated respite where people could stroll and cows could graze, even as the city was right there. But the fact is that traffic was just getting worse and worse in the city, and it seemed like the relief road through the meadow was the only path to making the city livable again. Plus, in the wake of World War II, it felt like change was in the air. Richard Ovenden writes, "The ravages of the war itself were beginning to recede, and ahead lay a new society, one that was modern, forward-looking, and embracing of technology. The social constraints which the war had helped to dislodge were further unsettled by the influx of new ideas about urban design and town planning." And indeed, there were a lot of new ideas coming in from new voices. Thomas Sharp was appointed town planner in 1945, and in 1948 he published Oxford Replanned, which outlined his scheme to restructure the city with some very helpful color diagrams. But although the initial reception for this was fairly positive, by the 50s, planners were starting to get serious pushback on the idea of building the relief road through Christchurch Meadow, especially from the university itself. As much as they did want to have their high street back, breathable and walkable once more, it seemed entirely obscene to start destroying and disrupting the beauty of nature just to make more room for machines that were meant to make people's lives more convenient in the first place. This felt like quite a slippery slope. Oxford had always been known for its history and its beauty, and if we were to begin carving up nature to make way for industry and machines, what was next? By the 1960s, this debate was still raging, no one really budging one way or another, and it was making national headlines. And it was in this climate that Tolkien wrote The End of Bovadium. And at first, he seemed to write it off as a kind of harmless amusement. He sent it to his son Christopher with the preface, "The enclosed nonsense may afford you some passing amusement. It was produced by coming across the old verses of Godley, together with a recrudescence of the debate about Oxford roads. But it has become over-elaborated from its original fragment too, with elements of satire upon other things than machine worship, the pomposities of archaeologists, the hideousness of college crockery, and whatnot. Beneath the layers of wordplay and insulting nicknames, I do think that there is a genuine frustration in this piece, with the way that we seem to view nature and the old ways and history as replaceable and disposable, or at the very least, not nearly as impressive as simple forward progress. And to Tolkien, these debates back and forth, the fact that they were even entertaining destroying the beauty of Christchurch Meadow just to take some relief from the roads of Oxford, it all seemed absurd. He understood that progress must be, and that mindful progress forward was an important thing, but he had seen through his own eyes in his own lifetime the ravaging impact that industrialization for its own sake could have on his beloved countryside. The nostalgic piece of his childhood had been disrupted enough as was, but to destroy a hundreds of years old preserved piece of heaven just so that more people could get in and out of work faster every day, it seemed like a complete confusion of priorities. And on top of this more existential, larger society frustration was annoyance towards bureaucracy. The kind of people that would sit there for like 30 or 40 years waffling back and forth on the particularities of a plan, rather than trying to make actual tangible change, rather than just having an opinion and sticking to it. He was clearly so annoyed with the way that scholars and experts and historians could look back on the past, on the falls of great civilizations, and talk about how stupid and foolish they were to let all of those mistakes happen, even as society collapsed around these same scholars and historians' heads. The end of Bovadium never ended up being published. Tolkien had gotten the go-ahead from his longtime publishers Allen and Unwin, but when he sent the piece to Clyde Kilby, who was helping him piece together the Silmarillion, he got some feedback that would completely stop this in its tracks. Kilby worried that although the piece was enjoyable, the Latin parts might make things a little bit inaccessible, and he also worried that because by the 60s, the car had become such a well-accepted part of people's lives, people might not see past the satire and the humor to genuinely accept the criticism that Tolkien was trying to level here. So it is that the end of Bovadium was pushed to the bottom of the pile, only to be resurrected some 60 years later this year. And what is either really interesting or really terrifying is that I do think that this piece might be more relevant this year than it ever was in Tolkien's era. The root problems that Tolkien identified in the Bovadium Fragments have only metastasized in the passing years, escalating to a point where I'm pretty sure Tolkien is doing backflips in his grave. We have continued allowing the demon to produce things for us, things that promise us convenience and ease and improvement, while they rob us of our quality of life. Although our machines have yet to overwhelm us into a complete screeching standstill, people are continuing to prioritize their own personal comfort and their own personal ease over the general welfare of humanity. Bureaucracy continues to prefer to get in its own way and deal with its own drama than to actually try and make real improvements in our way of life. We keep on praising and celebrating all these improvements and advancements in our technology, these tools that'll make our lives so much better and so much more convenient, when in reality, I am pretty sure that we are just building the speedboats that are going to carry us all across the river Styx. Now, I do not view the Bovadium Fragments as pure condemnation, as saying that we are most certainly damned. It's not that simple, and I think that the meta-narrative at play here makes that clear. There is still humor to be found in this world. There are still good people on top of the bad people. Yes, there are people that would look back on history and scoff at their stupidity, but there are also people like the old man, people with clear eyes who can see where we have gone wrong and desperately want to tell us how to get back on the right track. It is impossible for any of us to be all one thing, all good or all bad, all right or all wrong. After all, Tolkien himself, who wrote this piece, who wrote about the rage of the old forest, who described the march of the Ents, who homilized beautifully about the value of mindful progress in the scouring of the Shire, he also drove a car for a while, one that he liked enough that he named it Joe. After learning to drive, Tolkien took the entire family by car to visit his brother Hilary at his Evesham fruit farm. At various times during the journey, Joe sustained 2 punctures and knocked down part of a dry stone wall near Chipping Norton, with the result that Edith refused to travel in the car again until some months later. Not entirely without justification, for Tolkien's driving was daring rather than skillful. When accelerating headlong across a busy main road in Oxford in order to get into a side street, he would ignore all other vehicles and cry, "Charge 'em and they scatter." And scatter they did. Industrialization is not all bad. And even if it was all bad, who among us is not standing in the middle of a glass house trying to hurl a boulder? I mean, for all my environmental rage, I have to drive most places that I want to go. To be fair, the only places I can really walk to are the graveyard, the Wawa, and ironically my mechanic, but That's because I live in a Bovadiumized world. I live in suburban America, where the motores has been much prioritized over man. It is a very delicate balance to find. Because, yes, we should care and we should try to reduce where we can, but also, I can't allow the guilt of my carbon footprint to rest on my shoulders because it would crush me completely. And it's not like I asked to live in a world where I have to go through a dinosaur worth of fossil fuels just to get the food to eat for a week. But I don't think that all of that means that we should just fold completely. I do think that we need to work towards something better. We should try not to chase after the newest and shiniest little gadget or gizmo just because it promises us convenience. Because why is it that convenience is the greatest value that our culture has to offer? You know what's not convenient? Friendship, family, love, growth. None of these things are easy, none of these things are streamlined, all of these things are gonna take up more of your time than sometimes it will seem like you're getting out of them, but all of those things are things that are far more worth it than giving yourself another couple of minutes to do dishes or check your emails. And yes, of course, we can try and blame the demon. We can say that it's his fault in the first place because he's the one that invented the things, but that's not going to stop him from creating new things to distract us, new things to convince us that trying to get ahead of one another is the most important thing in our lives. And I will admit that it all feels kind of hopeless sometimes. How are we as individuals supposed to even try to make a difference when there are people and corporations with more money and power than any of us could hope to gain in a lifetime, burning up fossil fuels and dumping plastic into the ocean at an absolutely catastrophic rate? I mean, what am I supposed to do about that? What are you supposed to do about that? I certainly don't have the answer, but I do think that sometimes the only thing that we can do is try. In his essay on fairy stories, about 20 years before the writing of the Bovadium Fragments, Tolkien could already see the winds of problematic change in Oxford. He writes of a clerk who he overheard apparently welcoming in the oncoming roar of modernity, because at least it put the stodgy university in contact with real life. Tolkien protests. The notion that motor cars are more alive than, say, centaurs or dragons is curious. That they are more real than, say, horses is pathetically absurd. How real, how startlingly alive is a factory chimney compared with an elm tree? Poor, obsolete thing, insubstantial dream of an escapist. From the wilderness of my heart, I cannot exclude the question whether railway engineers, if they had been brought up on more fantasy, might not have done better with all their abundant means than they commonly do. Maybe it all really is a matter of mindset. Maybe even as you are a railroad worker, if you had enough run-ins with true fantasy, with what true beauty is, if you had your priorities right, you might be able to make that work right. You might be able to value the right things. Progress is one thing. It can be beautiful, and it is arguably unavoidable. But to think that the workings of iron and steel, to believe that the little pixels of the screen that I'm on right now, the illusions of technomancy, to think that those things are more real than flowers and friendship, more real than the vastness of the sky, I think is a massive misinterpretation of what it's all about. I am not making this video to lecture you on how your commute into work every morning is causing the downfall of civilization. I think that we all need little joys. I think that getting in the car with your friends to go grab ice cream or taking a flight to visit your family for the holidays is just a part of life. It's not great for the planet at large, but we're all just trying to get by. In my opinion, you really can't beat yourself up for falling into the pit trap that was dug directly in front of your feet. But you can, you should, and you must try to climb out of that pit. In this modern day and age, I think that all we really can do is try to get our minds right. Try and unlearn the idea that convenience is the greatest commodity that we have. Train yourself to recognize and appreciate quality over quantity. Yearn for something other than sheer novelty. Remember to think, to ask around, to research, and even to just sit and consider, rather than running off to Google or ChatGPT to fill your brain with even more regurgitated misinformation. Just try to remember that you are alive. You get to choose how you live your life and how you think about your life. And although you might not be able to get yourself from point A to point B as fast and as conveniently as the unholy motor, the journey may be well worth your while. I will admit that I'm always a little bit iffy about new Tolkien publications because I find that a lot of them just rehash familiar territory and material that we've already seen, but this one is very original, very interesting, and I highly recommend that you check it out. There's a lot of details in this book, especially in the extra material around the Tolkien story, that I wasn't able to explore here. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested, and I would love to hear what you think about it in the comments if you've read it. And if this is your first introduction to it, let me know what you think. Now, just a quick note, there will not be a new video next week, as I am currently celebrating American Thanksgiving with my family, but we will be back soon with a bunch of fun videos throughout December. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it or if you learned something new, and do consider subscribing if you want to tune in every week to hear me talk about the art of storytelling, sometimes The Lord of the Rings, and sometimes the other stuff that I like to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.